Yes. Thanks, Scott. Yes, so I'm with the newly named Play and Interactive Experiences Lab at New Mexico State University. So just briefly, my colleagues on this paper, Jess Hammer over at Carnegie Mellon at the CMU Ludo Lab, Bill Hamilton over at the Interface Ecology Lab at Texas A&M, and Ahmad Jarrah and Will Graves also at New Mexico State, and Oliver Garretson from Texas A&M. So I just wanted to start with a brief anecdote from a couple weeks ago about problems communicating in games. So I enjoyed the Destiny loot cave for a little bit when it was out, and I was having a great time just like, shooting a bunch of guys as they came out of this cave. But all of these high-level characters came over and were griefing me the whole time. They were jumping up and down in front of me, they were dancing, they were pointing, all of these totally incomprehensible actions. And I was trying to figure out, like, why are people such jerks? And then I finally get this message on the in-game messaging system. Someone actually took the time out to go use the controller and type a message to me to let me know that I was the jerk, and I was messing everything up by standing too close to this cave. So I got his permission, of course, to include this in the talk. So my point is, if I'd actually understood what people were trying to tell me, or if there was some way that people could communicate a little bit more effectively in the game, then this might not have been a problem. So in this talk, we're interested in cooperative communication mechanics, so ways that players can communicate with each other using the game mechanics, but not specifically talking or chatting or sending messages. So these are, of course, game mechanics, so they're explicitly invoked, potentially at the cost of other actions in the game. And we're also not interested in automated awareness cues. So those are valuable, of course, for supporting team coordination, but that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in people actually actively engaging in these things. So we took a grounded theory approach. We collected game mechanics on cards and independently clustered, so independent researchers clustered these together, and we developed two different coding schemes. Then we compared and merged and developed new sets of codes, and developed a set of categories, and then a new set of categories, and then we verified what we found by going back and playing and observing people playing the game just through the internet. So that's just kind of like a little bit of what the intermediate stage looked like. And then this is what we actually ended up with. So this is what we're discussing today. So we have 3 different kind of levels and then 6 different main categories. So for this work, we sampled game mechanics. We derived these mostly from personal experience and what we were able to find through like YouTube and Twitch. Unfortunately, we could not find any database that would actually give us the information that we needed to actually track down these kind of communication mechanics. So just briefly, these are the 40 games that we looked at for this particular talk. As we find more, we'll go back and revise things. And of course, we didn't categorize actual games, we categorized game mechanics in the games. So there are generally multiple mechanics for each one of these. So on to the framework. So we have primary types on the left, or yes, the left. The middle section is secondary subtypes, and then one of our trees actually has a tertiary section. So to start with, we look at environment modifying game mechanics. So these are game mechanics that allow players to change the game environment in some way in order to transmit information to other players. So as examples, if you think about signposts in Minecraft, or even buildings that are explicitly constructed to, say, look like an arrow or to point out a certain area, or also the warnings that players can inscribe on the ground in Dark Souls and Dark Souls 2. So these enable players to essentially transmit information across time, across games, across potentially game sessions or game worlds. They might warn of danger, they might provide hints, they might lie to people so that they do stupid things, but basically they're ways that players can communicate across games. And we also note that these are kind of asymmetric, right? So making the message actually requires a lot more investment than reading the message. Moving on, we have automated communication game mechanics. So this is where the game supplies some information on behalf of the player. So the player directs the game to basically provide that information to teammates. In the subtype constraints, we have constrained automated communication mechanics. The player basically chooses from some set of predefined messages. So there's some minimal set of input, and then that provides specific output. So if we think about the voice game system in the Tribes series, so essentially you type out these 3 characters and you get a much more complex message, or voice macros in Diablo, so I believe there are like 6 of them. Essentially they're ways that players can input something minimal, not take their focus away from the gameplay, but provide a much more complex message to their teammates. We also have context-sensitive automated communication messages. So these are ones that essentially provide some chunk of dynamic game state based on the player's context. So these are like shortcuts into essentially kind of what maybe your avatar has knowledge of, but you as a player don't, or might be too hard for you to express easily. So we think about in Tribes of Sin, there's an enemy spotting mechanic. Essentially, if you point your reticle at someone and press a single key, then your character will announce to the team that, hey, I've spotted a heavy in the mid. So it provides this kind of context-specific information, information that even as a player you might not even be able to pick up on yourself. Or, as we see in this picture, detailed item chat in Diablo 3, where you can essentially like shift-click an item and have a tooltip be displayed in everyone else's chat that shares that item information with them. Because if you see all of the information in that block, that would be pretty complicated to even type out in a shortened form. So these all simplify communication. They let players tap into avatar knowledge, but 2 concerns is that the lack of options might limit players if you don't kind of provide enough ways for them to express themselves. And also constrained mechanics especially may rely very heavily on recall rather than recognition. This can be really beneficial once players know what they're doing, but it may be a barrier to entry. Immersive game mechanics are designed essentially to bring people into the narrative, bring people into the game world. So kind of the quintessential example of this, of course, emoting in MUDs and MMORPGs. So dancing with people and bowing to people and waving to people. All these ways that you can kind of act in character, role play a character, and kind of stay in the game world. So of course these may deepen players' experience of the narrative, but they may not specifically advance game mechanics or expressly change game state. So our largest tree is the Expressive Tree. So it goes all the way down to the tertiary level, which is actually where I'm going to start. But basically it lets players share something about themselves with other players. So mechanical expressive game mechanics essentially change the game state, right? They may alter current positions of players or other things in the game environment, whereas cosmetic ones really just change the perception of the game environments. They don't really alter the game state. They may alter the game state later because players react to what they see, but they don't actually change it expressly. So planning expressive game mechanics essentially let players share what they intend to do. Our primary examples of this come from DayZ and Rust, which are kind of similar games. In Rust, it's generally accepted that if you're holding a torch, you're doing so in peace. You don't intend to kill anybody. Mechanically, this is supported because it's actually not immediate to swap a torch out for a gun, right? So you can actually enforce this in a certain way. Whereas holding a readied weapon in DayZ or Rust probably means that you're at least being cautious, if not actively ready to murder somebody. Emotional game mechanics allow players to essentially share emotive state with one another. So we see like cooperation happening.
Right.
Stop it. Completing this course was not a reason to behave like that.
Right. So you can high five your ally, right? It doesn't really change the game. Other than that, you get to have this nice shared feeling of camaraderie with your teammate, right? So Portal 2 has these. Army of Two is like the dedicated fist bump button. Elder Scrolls Online also has these kind of collaborative gestures. They enable player to essentially share emotions. And then creative essentially just lets players share things that they have created, lets them share their artwork or things that they've made. Little Big Planet is sort of the quintessential example of this. Players can put stickers, including custom ones, up on the game environment or their players, or your banners in Diablo 3, where you can essentially collect banner components and sort of create a personal creation that you can then, for some reason, cause to fall out of the sky and implant itself in the ground in the middle of the game. So our implications for using expressive game mechanics, basically they support extended collaboration. People can plan and work together in the game environment. They may support emotional contagion, so right, you're really into things, you're very excited, and you can kind of share that with your teammates. And they provide an outlet for people to share their creations in the game environment. Emergent game mechanics are sort of a weird sort of edge case. They're essentially non-communicative game mechanics that have been appropriated, or maybe even if they were sort of intended to be used for communication, they actually serve some other purpose. So really the main example of this is jumping in just about any game with multiplayer. So it's kind of this nice lightweight action. It does actually serve a purpose in the game, but people use it to draw attention to themselves, to draw attention to a location, to communicate impatience, etc. So there are kind of a number of places where these are used. The thing with emergent game mechanics, or communicative mechanics, is that they have to be interpreted. So when people were dancing in front of me in front of the loot cave, I was not interpreting that correctly to mean you need to move back. And they suggest areas for deeper design, that maybe players don't have what they need to communicate with each other. And then on to our last section is attention-focusing game mechanics. We have two subtypes of these. So these are basically ways in which players can draw other players' attention to specific things. Unbound game mechanics essentially just point your attention at something. They don't provide any further context. They don't provide any further information. So if we think about map pings in StarCraft, let's just basically say, look here, or banner drops in Diablo 3, or waypoints in Tribes, none of these have any extra information associated with them. They have to be disambiguated through some other communication. They just say, look here. Whereas semantically imbued attention-focusing mechanics basically provide some additional information to players. So if we look at advanced map pings in League of Legends, or the look and timer pings in Portal 2, so for example, here in League of Legends, we can see a player puts down an on my way ping. This basically puts a location on the game map. It shows an arrow indicating where the hero who is coming is located, as well as the hero's name. So it provides all this extra information. It's a lightweight interaction. In Portal 2, you can also tell players essentially to look here. There's also a timer ping which I have a video of, but basically is a synchronized countdown timer between two players.
I mean, you need one here. I can't shoot through that. You gotta let me back in, bud. Okay.
So these attention-focusing game mechanics enable teams to basically effectively cooperate with each other. And they support this difficult dictic reference in the game, where essentially you can say, I need your attention here. So if you can just point with your avatar, and there's no further support of that, that may be difficult to understand. But if I can point over there, and then you see a blip appear on your head-up display, then that supports you a little bit more. So in closing, our observations from this work, we basically saw that there was little support for people requesting information from their teammates. So while high-performance teams typically push information out to teammates rather than pull information from teammates, it's still important to have that ability. Almost every game mechanic essentially allowed you to share information out to people, but not to ask for it. We also saw very few environment-modifying mechanics. We thought these were really interesting, but they only appeared in, I want to say, a total of like 4 games. So maybe an area for kind of future investigation. And we also wanted to point out that anywhere where there are a large number of emergent mechanics, like communities that have kind of constructed this sort of set of appropriated game mechanics for communicating with each other, that might suggest some need for further design. So in moving forward, we are going to look at the player use of these game mechanics. So how do they actually impact team performance? How are players actually making use of them? And then we're also going to look at essentially using players' patterns of use for these in order to understand something about their ability to team coordinate. So I've done a lot of work on this using actual voice communication. Can we actually use game mechanics as kind of an alternative to that? And with that, I will take any questions.